Welcome to this video in the Sustainability Bites series, where we're trying to give you bite-sized bits of information on key and boilerplate issues that occur in almost all sustainability standards. And today we're going to be looking at one of the more important issues, that is the management of special values. Now, this follows on from the bite we've done on management planning, where we've said that there are a lot of sub-plans that come off that, and special values management plans are part of that. Now, all sustainability standards have an environmental focus, and some of them specifically require a plan to manage special values. It's given different names, but it all amounts to the same thing. And further to that, and before we start, I'd say that I'm using the term special values as a neutral term. I'm doing that on purpose. Other standards use terms, so for example, forest stewardship uses high conservation values, which is a term that is kind of proprietary, really. It's the High Conservation Value Network exists, and it's a fairly accepted term. Other standards, like say for Alliance for Water Stewardship, might use special water-related areas, and they purposely don't use the term high conservation value areas in water, for example. So they've got their own term, but it all amounts to the same thing. So we're going to call them special values. Now, like the management planning bite, one of the common mistakes in special values management planning is where you repeat procedures or external documents or whatever within the special values management plan. Try and avoid that and use links to other data or other procedures that you're going to use so you don't get into a documentation control nightmare. Special values management planning, like management planning itself, is something that should be kept simple. An overarching approach that tells you what you're going to do, but also then references other plans within your sustainability system or other operational plans where these values are being protected and the procedures will apply. So as before, your special values management plan might include a lot of links to other operational plans or maybe external documents which are kept up to date externally, so you don't have to continually keep them up to date within your own procedures. That's a better way of doing things than trying to put whole bunches of information into the special values management plan. The special values management plan then becomes an outline so people can see how you're operating within special values, and then they can dive down and look for more information if they need it. Now, in order to illustrate this, I'm going to use a fictional example of a forestry company as a model, but the principles will be the same for numerous other areas and other industries. So you might open with a scoping statement that says that this company identifies special values. Special values may be rare, threatened, endangered species, wetlands, waterways, or areas of cultural heritage. And that you will manage those as values, and that you will follow certain rules and certain guidelines. Now, a word about guidelines is that often standard setting bodies will give guidelines, or they may even have regional offices who've developed regional guidelines on how things should be dealt with. So that's an important point. You should be looking for those regional guidelines if they exist. And also do some research on third-party sources. I mean, just before coming on to this video, I did a quick bit of Googling, and I found several sources of information on how to manage orangutan habit, for example. And I know that here in Australia, we've got groups and conservation groups specifically dealing with the management of koalas. So it's a logical first place to look is in, if you're looking at certain values, is to look what's out there as guidelines in their management. In your written system, you also need to apply some definitions. Now, the thing to do would be to go to the standard that you're trying to address, in this case, Forest Stewardship Standard, and use those definitions, because that's what they're going to be using when they audit you. The first step, you might say in your standard, is that there's identification of special values during initial evaluation or planning and mapping processes when you first start up an operation. And here you could reference the procedures, for example. You might look at tools that you use to interrogate existing data, existing maps and overlays, or experts that you might consult for advice. So put those into your procedures. You might have other procedures where maybe you use things like rapid assessment tools, and we've certainly got some ebooks on rapid assessment tools for special values, maybe the experts, or you might have a particular group of experts who help you identify special values, and then you would go on to say that these would be captured on a map, and all of those values would be referred to during planning and operations. Then importantly, you go on to the management of the values, and here's where you lay out the values you identified and how you're going to manage them. And in some cases that might flick into a whole different type of management plan. The case in point would be a cultural heritage management plan, how you're going to manage those special cultural heritage values. Now, because this is a forestry example, you might put in here an area called a title called high conservation values, because that's the term that's applied in forestry. So for many companies, you might say that this company has high conservation values assessment for all new properties before operations start, and you might refer to those procedures. And then you would say that once you've identified those high conservation values and the strategies you're going to use to manage them, those will be incorporated into all operational procedures where those values might be impacted. And here I reflect again that a concept like high conservation values is a very well known and well researched topic, and there may even be regional guidelines that you can follow, giving you clear, concise information about what you should be doing with high conservation values. And I know here in Australia, I myself, when I was chairman of FSC Australia, was instrumental in developing the first HCV guidelines for forestry in Australia, and that document still exists and is extensively used. And I've said before, at the international level, Forest Stewardship Council also has guidance on high conservation values, and in the case of high conservation values, or HCV as we call them, there is something called the HCV network, which actually deals specifically across industries with high conservation values, and they've got a wealth of resources that should be used. Now in forestry, if we're going to use the high conservation value concept, there are 6 categories of high conservation value. Now I'm not going to go through them as HCV 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. I'm just going to simply mention them as concepts so you can apply them in other industries also. So your first point may be in your plan how you're going to manage rare, threatened and endangered species of fauna or flora, and how you're going to conserve high conservation ecosystems. So the first thing I suggest you do is to develop a table as a result of your research of publicly available maps or overlays, or use of experts, where you list those fauna and flora and ecosystems that actually exist on your property. Actually list them. And in that table where you've identified a value, you then need to go and find information or get some ideas of the management prescriptions you're going to put in place to preserve and enhance those values. And for simplicity, I'd suggest one table for fauna, one for flora, and one for ecosystems. So how's this going to look? Well, let's say that you've identified in your list of fauna a bird species, and you've consulted people about how to manage that, and that bird species might not exist actually in your estate, in your forests, for example. It might exist in the remnant forests or in areas associated or close to your forests. And you've taken advice, and the key thing about this particular bird species might be that it's sensitive during the breeding season, and you could disrupt breeding activity. And so a simple precaution might be that you've identified this bird, and in all operational plans the approach is that there is no site disturbing activities or disturbing activities at all during the breeding season. Simple as that. Now at this stage, having developed your plan, and especially with fauna and flora and ecosystems, which is where people tend to be quite sensitive, it's very and vitally important. In fact, it's required by most sustainability standards that you take your management plan, especially for fauna, flora and ecosystems, and go to the appropriate people and get comments on it. In other words, do a stakeholder engagement on your plan and listen to what those stakeholders have got to say. And going back to stakeholder engagement, especially stakeholder mapping, you need to identify who you're going to consult with, and don't just talk to local authorities or state legislation regarding rare, threatened, endangered species or a few experts. You need to work out who you need to talk to to get some rigor and robustness into your process. So, for example, here in Australia, we have koalas, and they're an iconic species. And there are organisations and a small army of volunteers who are dedicated to the care and management of this. And if you don't contact them and get their opinion on your plans, you're probably going to run into trouble in the future and probably not have the robustness and rigour into your plan that you really want. So don't leave these people out. Moving on with the forestry example and also the high conservation values framework, they also consider things called ecosystem services, things like management of slope, erosion, water quality and waterways. So here you might have procedures to do assessments as to whether or not those issues apply, rapid assessment tools for example. And having identified them and where they do apply, you might then say what procedures that, operational procedures, where you have considerations to these ecosystem services. So in the forestry situation, these might be hazard assessment procedures, site assessment, site establishment, and cultivation and planning, fire management, and of course harvest, where you might impact on these values. High conservation values also talks about the basic needs of local communities as a high conservation value. Basic needs like shelter, water, and food gathering. That may not exist in some countries, but in others it certainly does exist. So in these cases, in your procedures, you need to outline how you're going to determine what these values are. For example, community meetings, meetings with community leaders, and specific surveys to find out if these issues exist and therefore how you're going to deal with them. And then you're going to have to bring those into your operational procedures. So once again, in things like site establishment, fire management and harvest, if those values are there, the needs of local communities, they're going to be mentioned specifically in your procedures as to how you preserve and enhance those values. And in this case, when you're dealing with the basic needs of local communities, I think it's important that you link it in with your social performance planning, stakeholder engagement and social monitoring procedures as well. And we've dealt with that in some other bites. Similarly, you may have cultural heritage values, and these may be Indigenous cultural heritage values and then non-Indigenous values like sort of recent colonial history that need to be considered and preserved. So here, and I would suggest that you reference into a whole new area called a cultural heritage plan, and we'll be dealing with that again in another bite. And in that plan, you might say that the cultural heritage areas are assessed prior to any activities or site disturbing activities, such again as cultivation, mapping, etc. But also you've got to include in that, and that'll come up in the bite on cultural heritage, you've got to include extensive consultation with impacted Indigenous communities. Now we've talked about operational procedures and we've talked about more general things like harvesting or site establishment, etc. But there may be other small, more specific procedures that go directly to special values management. Let's go through a few of those. In the forestry context, we identify areas of native vegetation which are within the production area, but not part of the of where we're actually growing trees. And then we would have measures and prescriptions to protect these, because they also are a proxy for all of the special values, the fauna, flora, and maybe water quality issues that can come with proper management of those areas. So you might consider the remnant areas or the areas in your estate. And in the forestry example, we often have quite a lot of remnant areas, in excess of 10% of areas, and we consider how we're going to manage them. And some of those managements can be quite extensive and impactful. We used to talk about a strategy called fence and forget, which is a bit of an oversimplification, which basically means that when you have an area of native vegetation, you strenuous efforts to preserve it and stop it from being disturbed at all by operations or trespass or whatever. But it's more subtle than that. So in a forestry company where I was involved, they had something like 17 areas of remnant vegetation in excess of 50 hectares. So what they did in their procedures was an initial rapid assessment as to whether or not these may contain high conservation values. Now this is something again we'll deal with later, but it's something that they use their own people for. Now these people had good skills. They were good. They had ecology training and what have you, and they went in with a rapid assessment tool to look at the condition of the trees, the overstory trees and the understory populations. Again, looking at maps and overlays to see if there are any species involved, and making an assessment, a rapid assessment as to whether these were high, low, or medium conservation. And in a particular case, I think out of the 17, they found 15 that they thought were possibly high conservation values, and another 2 which were medium conservation values. And so going forward, obviously they protected those areas, but going forward they had a plan for more in-depth surveys by specialists of those areas who would then give prescriptions. And in our case, we used a not too expensive service, an organisation called Greening Australia, largely done with volunteers but specialists, who told us what was there. They did some ground truthing, and then they gave us some prescriptions, and those are the prescriptions we applied in our management planning for those areas. Now you might see that you don't have the staff or the skills to do in that area, but try and think outside the box. You might have local field naturalists, for example, clubs or whatever, who might be all too delighted to come in and give you their opinion and their help on whether or not you've got high conservation values. And so those rapid assessment tools don't have to be expensive. And again, we'll go through that again in a later bite. One of the things in preserving the values that you've got might be controlling exotic pests and vermin. So that might become a specific part of your plan. Now this comes into some difficult areas as well, because sometimes those pests are economic pests on forestry crops. And so we're talking about possible spray or chemical intervention, and here the expectation is that there will be what they call an integrated pest management approach, where you identify the problem and you have a threshold level, and then a response only if you meet that threshold level. And in most cases, and I've been extensively involved in this, you want to look at alternatives to chemical approaches, a strategy we called reduce, remove and replace chemicals of concern. And certain standards, especially forest stewardship, have had tremendous success in reducing the amount of chemicals used in these areas, which is it's a true sustainability goal. It's a real win-win. And so within your pest management strategy, you want to outline your integrated pest management approach and how you're part of that effort to reduce, remove and replace chemicals or substances that might be used. And in the procedures for managing pests, it's give consideration to biosecurity, which is the control of invasive species. If you take steps to stop species coming into your estate in the first place, then you don't need to have measures to control them. So control of invasive species is an important part of the plan for managing these special values. Related to that, there might be specific issues that you've got to deal with. So there might be specific issues that by law you've got to be involved with. I think in New Zealand, for example, by law you have to be involved in the control of the invasive Australasian brush-tailed possum, so you've got to be involved in that. And there's also other things which are key issues, and here in Australia in forestry we have something called Phytophthora or dieback, which we don't want in our forests, and we certainly don't want in our native forests. So our plans are going to have to deal with that as well, because that's a shared challenge that everybody has, that we have to be part of. There may be in special values management links to other tools like management of fire and fire control, and it may be that controlled burning in areas, reducing the fuel loads will reduce the risks of catastrophic wildfires, which of course would have a catastrophic impact on those areas and their special values. And in terms of managing special values in areas that we've identified maybe as native vegetation. I've seen some really excellent things as well. People getting into the revegetation, for example. So they may, as part of their plan, revegetate bank sides, and that does a couple of things. It reduces erosion, it increases water quality, and it allows for re-establishment of native forests. And in areas where the landscape is particularly disrupted, that might create what we call connectivity or wildlife corridors, connecting up areas of remnant vegetation, and is generally a good thing. And so good companies who are well into sustainability will be looking at these as opportunities not only to help enhance and preserve special values, but also for good operational reasons. And in this section of your special values management plan, when you're dealing with fauna and flora, put all your references down. Tell people where you got that information. It's also a good idea in your special values management plan to actually, within the text where you're saying this is an operational procedure that applies, but also at the end list there's operational procedures and other procedures that apply to your plan, so people can clearly see how you've constructed the thing. So this example is a forestry operation, but for a mining operation or maybe a marine farming operation, the issues may be completely different, but the approach is somewhat similar in terms of developing a special values management plan. As I've said in later bites, we're going to look at some of those sub-plans, and specifically cultural heritage management plans, as a subset of your special values management plan. So here at Pinnacle Quality, we've got extensive experience in developing special values management plan across a number of industries, and our approach is always to start with what you do, because you know your own operations and you know your own areas, so we always start with that and then build the plan from there. And that approach works far better than coming with some sort of off-the-shelf or completely foreign type of plan developed somewhere else and then pushing it onto your operation, because we find that many operations, let's say like a marine farming operation, they know the issues that they generally face. They know them instinctively, and therefore they're probably already thinking in terms of managing those values. The special values management plan merely formalizes that and fleshes things out so that we can all see. So if you need any help, do contact us. The contact details are at the end here. Do go to our website. We've got an ebook on special values management planning, cultural heritage management planning, and some of those tools I spoke about, like rapid assessment tools. So do take advantage of those. And as always, if you've liked this video, please press like. Please share with people who might also be wanting to hear about special values management planning and their sustainability goals. And also, we're very interested in your comments, so thank you.